Hello viewers, this is Mr. Vikrant. Today we shall discuss one of the stories from the treasure trove, The Little Match Girl, written by a Danish writer, Hans Christian Andersen. It is a fairy tale which the writer got inspired to write by a drawing of Johann Thomas Lundby. This story is also based on his mother's hardship as a child and his own struggle as a child. The story is about a little girl who is out into the street to sell matches in a gusty cold winter evening, but unable to sell matches, she dies of cold and hunger. As during the Victorian era, begging was illegal, therefore selling matches was a front for begging. The story is narrated in the third person account, and it is a didactic in form as it teaches the moral, that is to show compassion for the needy and the poor. The story also discusses few social issues like social classification between the rich and poor, poverty and child abuse, set on a street in a New Year's Eve. Let us discuss the story in detail. It was bitterly cold, snow was falling, and darkness was gathering, for it was the last evening of the old year. It was New Year's Eve. So the story is set on a evening of the old year, that is December 31st, which is the eve of the New Year. And the climate, the weather was bitterly cold, there was snowfall and darkness everywhere. So by stating this, the writer is able to create a gloomy atmosphere which foretells about a tragic end to the story. In the cold and gloom, a poor little girl walked bareheaded and barefoot through the streets. In such a freezing cold, this poor little girl, she is walking around through the streets bareheaded. She didn't have anything to protect her head from the cold or snowfall, nor did she have anything to protect her feet. Therefore, she was barefooted. She had been wearing slippers, it is true, when she left home. But what good were they? They had been her mother's, so you can imagine how big they were. Though she was wearing slippers, that's true, but that is of her mother's. Therefore, it was too big for her to give her any warmth to her feet. The little girl had lost them as she ran across the street to escape from the two carriages that were being driven terribly fast. Yes, of course she was wearing the slippers of her mother, but that too she lost when she tried to escape from the two carriages that were running so fast. One slipper could not be found, and a boy had run off with the other, saying that it would come in very handy as a cradle some day when he had children of his own. When she ran to escape from the two carriages, so she lost the slippers. One could not be found, and the other was run off by a boy, saying that it would be helpful for him to make a cradle when he has children of his own. So the little girl walked about the streets on her naked feet, which were red and blue with the cold. So losing both the slippers, now her feet naked, she is walking through the streets. The feet were red and blue with the cold. In her old apron, she carried a great many matches, and she had a packet of them in her hand as well. So she had a great many matches in her apron, and few she had in the hand to sell them. Nobody had bought any from her, and no one had given her a single penny all day. She crept along, shivering and hungry, the picture of misery, poor little thing. Yes, as everybody was busy in celebration, as it was the New Year's Eve, the waiting for the New Year, and it was the Christmas season, so everybody was busy in celebration. But this little girl was out in such a freezing cold to sell matches. Therefore, since everybody was busy in celebration, nobody paid attention or nobody even bought any matches from her. As a result, she hadn't earned a single penny all day. In spite of that, she kept going around the street selling the matches, shivering and hungry, the very picture of misery. Poor little thing. The snowflakes fell on her long golden hair, which curled so prettily about her neck. But she did not think of her appearance now. Yes, we know that there was snowfall, and she even did not have anything on her head. Therefore, the snowflakes fell on her long golden hair, which curled so prettily about her neck. But she did not think of her appearance now, as nobody bothered to look at her. Therefore, she was also not bothered about her appearance now. Lights were shining in every window, and there was a glorious smell of roast goose in the street, for this was New Year's Eve, and she could not think of anything else. Yes, the houses, the Christmas trees, they were beautifully decorated with the lights and balloons. Therefore, she could see the lights shining through the window, and she could also get the glorious smell of roasted goose as she was walking through the street. But she could not think of anything else. She could only think was how to sell the matches and go back home. She huddled down in a heap in a corner formed by two houses, one of which projected farther out into the street than the other, but though she tucked her little legs up under her, she felt colder and colder. Yes, finally, she sat down in a heap formed by in a corner formed by two houses, one which projected farther than the other. And she sat down, she crouched her little legs under her, but she felt colder and colder. She did not dare to go home, for she had sold no matches and earned not a single penny. Her father would be sure to beat her, and besides, it was so cold at home, for they had nothing but the roof above them, and the wind whistled through that, even though the largest crags were stuffed with straws and rags. For two reasons, she didn't feel to go back home. One is, she hadn't sold any matches. As a result, she hadn't earned any single penny. Therefore, her father would definitely beat her. So she was afraid to go home. And second is, the house was no better place than the street, because there was cold at home as well, because the house had nothing else but only the roof, and the roof also had few holes through which the wind whistled. Therefore, she did not feel to go back home. Her thin hands were almost numb with cold. If only she dared pull just one small match from the packet, strike it on the wall, and warm her fingers. So therefore her feet and hands were numb with cold, the freezing cold. But she felt, or she wanted to pull out just one match, light it, and get a warmth from her. But she hesitated, as if she does so, her father would beat her. Therefore, she only wished, and finally she gathered up the courage, and finally she pulled one out. Scratch! How it spluttered and burnt. It had a warm, bright flame like a tiny candle when she held her hand over it. But what a strange light! Finally, she mustered up the courage and pulled out one match, and it spluttered and burnt. It gave out such a loud noise and burnt, and it also gave a warm, bright flame, which was like a tiny candle, a small candle. And when she held her hand over it, she felt like it was a strange light, because she felt she got such a warmth from the candle that it was able to warm her fingers. It seemed to the little girl as if she was sitting in front of a great iron stove with polished brass knobs and brass ornaments. The fire burned so beautifully and gave out such a lovely warmth. And immediately she was able to visualize as if she was sitting in front of a great iron stove which was decorated with polished brass knobs and brass ornaments. And the stove also burned so beautifully, the fire burned so beautifully that it gave her a very lovely warmth. Oh, how wonderful that was! The child had already stretched her feet to warm them too, when out went the flame. The stove vanished, and there she sat with a burnt match in her hand. Yes, so she visualized as if she was sitting in front of a great iron stove. But when the light went out, the stove vanished and she sat there with a burnt match in her hand. So this, the visualizing or the vision of the iron stove would depict her longing, her desire to get to warmth. Alright friends, so we stop here. So with the rest of the part we will discuss in our next video. Thank you, keep watching.